I'm Greg Jeschke, and on this episode of Postdoc, we're talking with Dr. Alex G., who is featured in the documentary Justified Journey. Alex, thanks for taking some time to be with us and talk about this.
It's glad to be here, and it's good to see you again, Greg.
All right, it's been a little under a year since Justified Journey was released. What's been the reaction that you've heard?
You know, it's touched people deeply. I'm part of a team that's planning my high school reunion this year, and one of my classmates saw it and told me she was so struck by it that she just started sharing it with friends. She's white, but I think people are looking at it and thinking, I didn't know that this was part of your story or the story of Black people in America, Alex. So I think it's very eye-opening, and people are deeply touched. They said that the footage is just so clear, the story is compelling, and the insight that I share as I'm processing all of this is very touching and very authentic.
Now, just to give people a little bit of background, you were obviously the key person featured in this documentary, and we worked very closely together. But ultimately, this was a project that I produced and directed. So you, at the point of having everything filmed, waited for what I was going to present as the result. I guess I'm wondering, we haven't talked much about this, but what was your initial reaction when you first saw it finally after, well, it was probably 6 months between our last interview and when we had our first viewing?
Well, Greg, I was really nervous during the waiting period. And because I'm not a producer, I'm not aware of the length of time between shooting something and actually having it edited and ready for showing. So I think I had a lot of time to think, oh, I should have said this, I shouldn't have said that, or I should have emphasized this point. It was also the first time you had ever produced a documentary and you were not in it. And so I knew that we were doing something very different, and I wasn't sure how well I could tell the story. I knew I gave interviews, but I was thinking, how are we going to string these pearls together so that it's cohesive and it gives a message? And when I saw it, I think I called you and said, Greg, this brought tears to my eyes. I didn't think that it would be this smooth, this clear, this honest, this professional. And I don't mean like I didn't expect it to be professional, but because of the uniqueness of just having these interviews with me and no one else is on the camera except me and some of the cousins I'm meeting, I just had questions, and it's powerful. Every time I watch it, I'm stirred.
You know, it's interesting, Alex, that this all started with your genealogy, your search for your family history. And since this has been released, obviously more and more of your family is picking up on it. What has been the reaction from members of your family and people maybe that have reached out who you didn't even know were out there?
Sure. First, I'll say that I've been hearing from lots of people who are interested in their own genealogy. And so it has sparked that. So people started saying, hey, here's something I wrote, or here's some pictures I have. So it brought out sort of the hidden genealogist or amateur genealogist. I did a podcast interview with cousin John's daughter, Meg, and she sent a copy of that interview to her cousin, Brandon. So Brandon is a descendant of RLG as well. And so, because John is a generation ahead of me, my interaction with Brandon is very interesting. The cool thing about meeting my cousin Brandon is that he too is a descendant of RLG. And so RLG is his great-great-grandfather, and Henderson is my great-great-grandfather. So it's interesting to think that we are great-great-grandsons of brothers. And he and I, are closer to age than John and I, and he's a pastor. And so we have to wrestle with the theological implications of this. Even as the church in general wrestles with its role in slavery, being complicit, buying into it, supporting it, not preaching against it, denominations being divided over it, and even people still saying it didn't happen or it wasn't that gruesome and we should just move ahead. I feel that we now have this moral and theological and even spiritual obligation to talk about it amongst ourselves, Brandon and I, but also to the broader members of the clergy. So he and I have been developing a relationship and a rapport that I've enjoyed. I remember the first conversation. I was driving to Chicago for a meeting, and we must have talked half of the way there. And so much of our story is very common. And even though you look at us, we are so different, so different. On a soulish level, there was a sense of connection that I felt at a reunion of Black relatives, and someone says, oh, that's your umpteenth cousin over there, and you talk with them and find out you got things in common, but you immediately connect with some of them. I felt that connection with Brandon, and I think it was mutual. On a trip before this pandemic stuff happened. I was in Southern California, and he and his wife got together and took me out for dinner. When I parked, it was nighttime, so I couldn't read the numbers on the houses. But he just like ran out the house and just ran up to me, walked up to me and hugged me. But he actually like ran out the house. And he said, well, I want you to meet my daughter before she goes to sleep. And so when I went into her room, she was about 6, and she said, Daddy, is he related to us? And I looked at her and said, yeah, honey, we're cousins. And she looked at her parents and she said, Daddy, he looks different. And, it's so funny that we grew up and said we don't see color. Here's a 6-year-old kid saying he looks different. I think that's beautiful because kids can be so honest and authentic. She didn't assign anything to my looking different, but that's the first thing she noticed. I think she's just trying to figure out at that young age, are you sure we're related? Like no one else in our family looks like that. She didn't say that, but by saying he looks different after asking were we related, I thought was very cute and very honest.
Alex, in a previous conversation recently between you and I, you had mentioned that Brandon brought up the question of an apology, which leads to sort of that bigger conversation of reparations. Speak a little to that. Did that strike you as a surprise? And what have you thought about since he brought that up?
I don't think his response was much of a surprise because I sent that clip to him to see what he thought. But my response was, when you consider history, an apology seems so insignificant. It's important because Brandon had nothing to do with this history. He just woke up one day and just thought, oh crap, I'm the great grandson of a slave owner. And my great uncle was a slave and Black. And so I think the discussion is that I think there does need to be some remorse in just understanding the reality of economic fortitude, because there's such an idealism of Western ruggedness, American ideals. You pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. You go from rags to riches, and it's humbling, I think, for white people who find out that their wealth was largely can be largely attributed to slavery. Because then you have to ask about your education and your health care and everything that you've had that's given you a leg up. So more than just saying, I'm sorry that happened to you, I'd rather have a discussion about what's happening with you. Like, how does this make you rethink your history? Because the apology, I wouldn't turn it down. I would say, what do you say? Oh, it's okay. Or, yeah, I know. It's like one of those things when someone says, I'm sorry your mom died. And like you say, thank you, but that doesn't feel appropriate. So I would welcome the apology. I don't know what I would say in response to it, but what's more important than an apology is understanding. So how does this affect how you think about your journey, your wealth, your opportunities, your nation? To me, that's more important. And then what will you do with it? What will you say to your children about this? That's the part that I think about, Greg, as we really start moving ahead, because this is not just hypothetical. It's in our blood. We share DNA. We share Reuben Joshua G. And so how does that clarify the American story, the American dream for some and a nightmare for others? I think having relatives hold that is really important. I'm not expecting them to give me 40 acres and a mule, because I don't want them to think that that's why I'm doing this documentary. I'm doing this documentary so that America understands America, and so that they can better engage the conversations about Black Lives Matter, economic stability, the loss of economic wealth, the impact of all of that still touches us today. I want them to rethink race relations, police brutality, disparity. I want them to do that. Let's turn this around. You're not going to fix that with 40 acres and a mule. I'm good. But how they think and talk about it at their gatherings, at their dinner table with their children, that's what's really important if we're going to turn this around in this nation.
Our trip to Mississippi, when we went to film a bulk of the documentary, Alex, gave you a lot to process. And one of the key points that I bring up to people when they ask me what I noticed was the feeling of comfort and the feeling of kind of being at home that you had there in Mississippi for that short time that we were there. as compared to where you grew up here in the upper Midwest. Talk a little bit about that. Has time eased that at all? But that sort of feeling that you felt more at home in Mississippi, regardless of the the backdrop that is presented there with your family, versus up here in the upper Midwest where you grew up.
Sure. I think what many African Americans will say is that in places like the rural South, you feel and understand the racial tensions, that they are palpable and they are articulated as well. And so you sort of know how to conduct yourself. In the North, in places like Wisconsin, where we don't see race, we don't talk about race, it's not really an issue. We're post-race, that doesn't matter. You still feel those residual effects, but you can't identify them because everyone's saying, no, we marry our children, live next door to us, go to our schools. We don't care. We don't care. And so there's something about the honesty of the South that was very interesting. You may remember that as I talked with James and with I'm drawing a blank on Mary Ann, they said we know that there was slavery, and we know that we had slaves. But we didn't have anything to do with that, but we know that it's real. So we've been on Ancestry. We've been trying to understand our Black relatives. I think that level of honesty was just really important. In Wisconsin, when I say I found out that I'm a descendant of a slave owner, there's shock. Like people didn't believe that it happened that widespread, or that I could be part white, that my grandfather's grandfather could be half white. My great grandfather was biracial because both of his parents were biracial. And so I think people here say, in Mississippi, it was a part of life. They knew that there were Black kids who were half white. They knew because they played together. My grandfather said he played with his white relatives until their other white relatives came over, and then they had to go in the back door. But, kids can get beyond that kind of stuff and just play if they're having fun, until parents start asking, why are you playing with them? Or you can't hold their hand, or you can't drink out of that same cup. We begin to learn those things. But as young kids, they just knew they had the same last name and lived on the same farm. And so, but also feeling close to my history, Greg, is what made me connect as well. And whether it's true or not, I'll just state it because it's what I felt. Although I'm not sure if Mary Ann or James knew what to do with me. Like, why was I really there? Why was a Black person with their last name or their family's last name down in Mississippi with a white film crew? I think they feared I was trying to embarrass them or something like that. But I also felt that there was a sense of acceptance just by face value because they knew history. So when we were in Mary Ann's store, the G grocery store, when she called James, she said, "Hey, James, yeah, this is Mary Ann. Yeah, some of our cousins are down here and they were trying to find Reuben's gravesite. So I'm going to send them up to you." And she didn't say, now she might've did this when I left, but she didn't do it in my face. "Hey, we got some Black relatives. We got some Black folks that stay in their relatives." She said, we've got some relatives down here and they're looking for our great grandfather's grave, because Mary Ann and I are the same distance from Reuben, which is ironic. That was very interesting to me. It wasn't like there's some people down here, there's a film crew, there's some guy. She said, we got some kin, we got some family members. And that just made me just think about that a little differently. And it made me wonder, what would it be like if I spent time in the South and the Black G's and the white G's got a chance to get together and connect, not just around history. That's there. At some point, we got to have that talk. But just what does it mean to be family today? And can we get to know each other? And can we model something different for this country in terms of race relations? I don't know if it's feasible. I don't know if that's too Pollyanna, but I found myself dreaming about that while I was in Mississippi.
And that kind of leads me to my final question for you, Alex. One of the things that you voice in the documentary towards the end is the thought, and I realize it was sort of inspired perhaps by the moment, not necessarily something you had planned, but creating a center for thought on race relations there on some of that plantation land of the G's where Reuben held slaves. Have you thought much about that since then? And I just kind of wonder where that might be percolating with you.
Sure. I would still like to do something that perhaps is a monument. I have since rethought the idea of the center, because one, it would be difficult for me to get to it, to learn to lead sessions. although it would be so meaningful. Actually, as you know, here in Madison, Greg, I'm working on building the Center for Black Excellence in Culture, and I'm going to put that work into the center.
Okay.
So I will make sure that there's space in there for either Black genealogical studies or some type of home or base where people can gather from all across the country to talk about issues of race. So I've not forgotten the idea. I've just relocated it closer to Madison so that it can be within the proximity of my other operations, and so that it's easier to have ongoing gatherings there. Again, there would be something so symbolic about being down in Mississippi. I haven't ruled out perhaps having a small home there, or like a small cottage, so that during the winter, if I want to go down and hang out and just spend some time, I would like to be on or near that land. I know that sounds strange. It sounds like, why would you want to be there? And somehow I feel close to my history. And when I think about the fact that Henderson, my great grandfather, amassed wealth, or at least land, within a generation, like his grandchildren were donating land to churches and to the first school district in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. The fact that he could be born a slave, have a slave master be his father, and yet bequeath land or teach his children to buy land so that by the time his grandchildren come along, they are a known entity. And the fact that the children from that school district ended up going to Jackson State and becoming school teachers who retired in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, blows me away. And so whether I'm on the actual G plantation land or some of the land that my Black G relatives own, there's something about being in that place that grips me very, very deeply. In fact, Greg, I have not felt anything like that probably since I saw Alex Haley's Roots when I was in middle school. I felt something very similar to that in Ghana. I had a chance to be in Mississippi and then also go to Ghana. I believe it was the following year. And those two trips rooted me so much in my history that I feel like it changed me on a psychic level, on a social, on an emotional, on a spiritual level. I feel like I was just really transformed because the message I got from West Africa is that you are the descendants of Africa's strongest of the strong. And you all have come back 400 years after the 1619 slave trade to show us the resilience of Mother Africa in you. Then they marked us with a special sort of mud or clay mixture in our arms to say, you are survivors. And it was almost like a renaming ceremony. I felt that somewhat in Mississippi as well. So in the past few years, I've rethought my place and my space in the world, and none of that is rooted in inferiority complex or sense of being less than or innately debilitated. And that's been extremely empowering. So what's fueling the work of our center is this sense of resilience and the strength and the resolve of our ancestors, and not just that they were owned or beaten and raped and all those things, which is what we're taught, but not the strength and the message of resilience. And so I feel that it was equivalent to, I don't know, a deep programming on some level about who I am and the folks from whom I descend. And I feel better positioned to take on the world and to bring others along and educate others along the way so that we can move towards a greater sense of healing. And I think the documentary, the trip, the conversations, I feel that all of those prepared me for my trip to Africa, so that I could come back and think through expanding our history courses that my organization offers, Black history courses, or building this center. I feel like all of it was a progression to get me ready to lead a movement towards greater racial healing and equality.
Well, Alex, I want to just thank you again for letting me tell your story in the form of a documentary like we did. It's been great catching up with you, and maybe we'll have to do this in another year or so just to kind of periodically process what's been going on, because obviously this is an ongoing process, not just something that takes place and you put it away.
And Greg, I really appreciate you hearing the story, taking it seriously, and wanting to make it happen. I am forever grateful for that. I also want to congratulate you for the recognitions that the film is getting. The Indie Film Festival named it Documentary of the Year for 2020, and I know that it's being submitted into the Winnipeg Film Festival, or has been. These things are very, very exciting. So I want to congratulate you on your work. You know, here in Madison, I watched you, for years on television, deliver news and inform us. And so I appreciate the fact that you've just brought all that professionalism and experience into this. And maybe the next time we talk, Greg, we'll also touch upon the fact that the irony that we were looking back at race relations in the United States, and to see the turn that we've taken since we filmed this. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll say an uncovering of sentiments, not necessarily a return to them. I just think it's been the uncovering of certain kinds of sentiments. So perhaps the next time we talk, you and I will discuss how much we've progressed in some ways, and then in others, how little we've progressed in terms of race relations in America.
All right. It's an ongoing conversation. Alex G., thank you so much for being with us on this first edition of Postdoc. Thanks.